So the first thing that Canadian ecosystem really surprised me was, and I don't see this in India and I don't see this in US as much, where there's an incubator for everything in Canada, which is extremely surprising. You want to be in fashion, there's an incubator. You want to be in food, there's an incubator. You want to be in music, there's an incubator. You want to be in a random field, whatever it is, there's probably an incubator out there for you. And tech obviously has a bunch of incubators. And even when it comes to tech, one of the best things is incubators exist not just for tech, but for people from all different backgrounds. So if you're in tech, but you are from a certain part of the world, there might be an incubator. It was very surprising of an ecosystem. I was like, this is great because it just promotes entrepreneurship at a whole different level. And I don't think I've seen that even in the US and India. Why? Because a lot of these incubators are actually government supported or government funded. And then you also have small business centers in pretty much every city and every major city, let's just say. The Brampton one was called the Brampton Entrepreneur Center Innovation District.
The Research Labs podcast by Sunday Pajamas.
Good morning, Jasmeet. It's around 11 a.m. here in Canada.
Yeah.
We are recording this episode right after a very heavy rainfall, and you live in Toronto.
Yep.
Was like the area around your house clogged with water, or that was not the case?
It was not the case, like not around my place, but yeah, parts of Toronto did have that waterlogging issue happen on that day, though. Like when we had like the massive waterlogging issue for the first time since I've lived in Toronto for the last like 3-4 years. For the first time ever, I had an electricity like go out in my apartment. That's never happened. So this was like one of those things where this happened for the first time. Like how and it was like for an hour, I think, but for the first time ever, which was surprising.
It was quite something, actually.
As soon as that power went out, I was like, oh, I can't do anything now. My laptop's going to start discharging soon and can't do anything. I was like, I just have to be productive on my phone right now. And, or just shut everything down. Don't know how long the power outage is going to be. Just maybe try reading a book now. And then so I alternated between going on my phone to like finish up all the meetings, like, hey, there might be some power outage issues. If I don't show up to the meeting, we'll talk later. And then just sitting and reading a book for like an hour and a half till the power came back. How was it for you?
Nothing happened at our place, quite frankly. I just had a lot of family and friends reach out to make sure that everything was okay because they had no idea what was going on. But I was like, okay, that happens here as well.
Yeah, this is the first time it's happened for me, right? So yeah, so I've lived here so long, but this is the first time it's happened. Like, how surprising! Yeah, it was surprising for me.
Well, I would say, start off this conversation, right? Could you share a little bit about, what is it that you're building right now? What do you do? And just like a idea so people are with speed as to, what you're up to.
Okay, so that there's so much to share. So I've been in robotics for 20 years, and that's been my life forever. Electronics sort of has been my life forever. I saw a problem and I'm trying to solve that problem by starting a VC firm now within this space of physical AI. And my focus is it's been my life, and I figured, you know what? There's something that needs to be done in the VC ecosystem, and I think I have to be the one to do it, which is what I'm doing right now.
Could you elaborate more on what you mean by the term physical AI?
We all are familiar with AI as it is right now, with LLMs and sort of LVMs and LAMs kind of coming out of the woodworks. But there's a part of this AI, and on this journey from going to AI as it is right now to artificial general intelligence, there's a stage there which is involving hardware. So you have robots, you have IoT, you have wearables, you have XR devices, and all kinds of sensors coming into the picture, feeding the AI data, and then allowing that AI to sort of learn from its environment. And that's where physical AI fits in. So it's a very academic term, but that's like the combination of hardware and AI coming together, AI learning from real time hardware sensor data and being able to respond to that with, let's say, robotic arms or wheels or legs or whatever. Just being able to interact with the world essentially.
And how does such a system work from a technical standpoint? So there are two aspects to it, from what I understand. There is a hardware side of it, the sensors itself, the motors to move the robot, the camera system that takes the video feed in, and then there is the software aspect of it, which makes sense of the data collected and makes a decision as to the goal it wants to achieve or the action it needs to take. If you could share, how would a technical person visualize that system?
It depends on how complex you want it to be. There's a vision of this in my head where it's extremely complex, where all kinds of AI, so not just one, but all kinds of large models are sort of feeding data into a hardware ecosystem and gathering data from that hardware ecosystem. So let's say, for example, you have a robot butler in your house, right? And now this butler robot is able to a gather its own data from its sensors and from its wheels, from its arms, from tactile sensors, from force sensors, all sorts of things. And it's able to perceive how it should navigate the world. That's just the internal AI being used to make the robot better in the way it navigates and how it perceives the world while it's navigating. For example, what is the friction of the floor right now? Like, is there going to be skidding, or is this a smoother floor? Is this a marble floor? Is this a wood floor? What does that friction coefficient look like? How it needs to adjust its speed? So that's one part of that AI system, just making the AI, just the navigation piece of it. The second part of that is the conversational and human interaction piece of it, which is where sort of LLMs can come in. So now you have people being able to interact with it, people being able to give it commands, and it understanding how that command is being given. For example, we've had like conversational text to speech thing forever, but understanding the semantic of it, like, is this person talking to me in a rude way? Is this person talking to me angrily? Are they angry? Can I do something to make sure that they are no longer angry? How can I make their life better? So that's one piece of that, again, of AI that can be used. And there's another piece of that is the vision piece. There, that is perceiving the world through the vision aspect, and that vision could be, is there this person allowed in this environment? Is this person a guest in the house, or is this person breaking into the house? Is this person in my system or not? So that's just the robot piece now. And then you want the butler robot to do a lot of things around the house for you, right? When it's doing the things around the house, now there will come a time where your devices respond automatically to you. You've got IoT on the edge of a lot of devices, and they can sort of be controlled. But a robot, for a robot, it's very difficult to control the way their devices work if they're not humanoid robots. Humanoid robots can work perfectly well in human environments, right? Because we've built the world around us to be like efficient for us. But for a normal robot that's not a humanoid, it's very difficult to control the rest of the environment. But through IoT, it may be able to communicate with all of your devices. And so that AI piece of A, being able to control like a swarm of devices, and then a bunch of these swarm of robots being able to communicate and share information among each other. So there's a whole sort of network of where AI and hardware sort of interact with each other, and it'll be a vast, ubiquitous computing sort of environment when we get to that stage. So that's the combination of hardware and AI, and it's going to permeate, hopefully, all of our lives, and permeate and make us a lot more better at everything we do essentially.
So the one use case that we discussed was the butler use case, which is, I
Hmm.
would say, a very non-industrial use case. It's for the people to put the robot in the house. Do you also see the industrial use case of physical AI that can maybe help optimize supply chain workflows? That there are already robots which are working in warehouses to kind of take things around on their own without human interaction, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So all of these, we've had them for a while, right? We've had the industrial robots, sort of AMRs in the industry, warehousing industry, for a while. I think my earliest memory of working on that is when I was like an early intern in Grey Orange, which was one of India's first companies to do this, right? So that's been around for a while, and I think the thing that happened was once it's set up in the industry and on the industrial side of it, and the manufacturing side, on the supply chain side, we will start to see these things sort of become smaller and being more accessible. So let's say you have something like that in an industrial environment and it's learning. In the industrial environment, things are very fixed, right? You have a floor plan, they're indoors, there's no sudden changes happening in the map of that environment, there's no sudden human interactions happening within that environment. Now, same robot, you put it out in an environment where there's a lot of foot traffic and there's a lot of people coming in and out. So let's say in a hotel, in an hospitality environment, where in whatever environment that is, like it's a thing in that environment. Now it has to respond more quickly, it has to adjust more quickly. If it doesn't do that, it will start bumping into people. If it doesn't take care of the vision aspect and be highly accurate with that vision and the AI aspect, it could lead to disasters happening. So same thing, you put in a hotel room, now it's able to carry your luggage from the lobby to your room, right? Because they have the capability of lifting, it's just a different environment. So having a very sanitized sort of an environment that doesn't change versus an environment that's very dynamic is a very different ball game altogether. So the physical AI and AI sort of improving now at a point where we can have these systems be in more complex environments. That's the piece of this which I really like, that we're finally ready to have these come out of the industrial side and go on to where people are actually interacting with it on the daily, right? So that's, I love that piece of it, and I love the fact that we are going to start seeing more of this. I try and make sure that people's perception of robots is a lot better than it is. Some people are still scared about robots, and I try and do my part of sort of making sure that that's not the case.
Could you share some stories about how you got started up with robots? What was your initial fascination with them, and what were like the early days to kind of get yourself to work on them, essentially as a career?
Oh man. Oh, so I've been an electronics nerd since I was like 5, 6 years old. And part of that is because my dad used to hoard a lot of computers, and we had really old computers that were outdated even by the time I was born. At that point of time, we had, I think, like a dozen computers that was semi-functional and had like 8.5-inch floppy drives. And so these was like the initial things that I got exposed to. And I also had like German robot toys as a kid, among other things. And I think the first laptop I ever used was, I was like at 6 years old. I think it was an IBM or something. And so I've always sort of had that throughout my life. And I don't think that ever changed. That has been through with me since that age, right through high school. By the time my older brother went into engineering, he went into electronics engineering, and in his first year, second year, he was having to do electronics project, and he wasn't really fascinated by it as I was. So I used to sort of help him out with his electronic projects, and work on like 555 timers and do all sorts of things that early engineers use, and I was already good at it. And so when the time came to go into engineering, my parents were like, yeah, you're going to computer science instead of electronics. And I ended up into computer science, but this allowed me to sort of create the combination, like bring those two things together, of the electronics and sort of the computer science aspect of it. And by third year, I was like working on computer vision applications, image edge detection. I was doing object recognition, those sorts of like digital image processing projects. And then I was like, I think I want a robot to have this capability. And so I started going deeper into how to work with electronics a little bit more from a coding perspective. How do I program microcontrollers, not in assembly, but more in C, C++? Because we were taught assembly back in college. I was like, this is too tough. I don't want to do it this way. I like the computer science aspect, but I want it to be much more smarter. And so I started using computer science, C, C++, I think, and combining that with like embedded C. So that embedded C sort of went to electronics, got better at sensors, got better at programming microcontrollers like 8086 and a few others along the way. And then I think, Atmega 32s was the first one. Atmega 8 and Atmega 32 was like the first ones that I used. And then from then on, I think I never looked back. And then I was like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I want to be either building robots or helping other people build their robots, essentially. So that was like the early start of that career. And so when the time came for my master's, for my computer science master, I was like, do I go into master's as an MBA? Because I was very sure I was going to start a company. So I had both options. I was like, do I go into an MBA or do I go deeper into the tech side and do an MS in computer science? And I chose to do computer science at that point of time, which was a great decision because it ended up giving me exposure to self-driving algorithms. So by the time I was doing that, I had finished my graduation sort of research was based around self-driving algorithms. Part of the projects that I did was on like humanoids. Some of the part was involving computer vision applications, and I was teaching computer vision applications to PhD students in the university. And so it was this really great combination of just everything I really wanted to do. And from then on, I graduated and I said, why do more people not have access to this? Why do more people not get into this? Why am I usually the only computer science person in a room full of electronics and mechanical people learning robotics? And so I thought, okay, there's some problem in this ecosystem that needs to be solved. So that started my sort of my startup journey. You want me to elaborate on the startup journey?
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
So the first problem was that we didn't have hardware access, like good quality level hardware, we didn't have access to in India. And most of the people didn't use the components or had never even heard of the components that I was using. So we had cheap electronics from that would get imported into India or were built in India, but they allowed you to do cheap projects, maybe limiting you to let's say line follower and edge avoiders. Those were the two things, and they use the same hardware, just the coding is a little bit different for both of those. So people were stuck doing those projects over and over again in their engineering, and they couldn't go beyond that because there just wasn't hardware available. And so my problem was, why does that happen? So I looked into that industry for 6 months, right? I spent I think half of 2013 just looking into that, like what does this supply chain look like? Why do we not have hardware coming from other countries into India? Or where is it being made, and why is it not coming to India? So there was countries like South Korea was making a lot of stuff that was really great for roboticists. We had some access to like the cheap Chinese sensors, but we didn't have access to the quality stuff. Like, okay, this is it's and there's some stuff happening in Europe at that point of time. There's some stuff that was being made in Canada at that point of time. And so I was like, why does this not come to India as often? So the problem was taxation. The problem was importing. The problem was supply chain itself. And I was like, oh, that's a big. So all of the other online stores in existence at that point when I started, and there were like 40 of them when I started. And so all of them had the same hardware because they were buying from local markets and supplying to having adding like a profit margin on top of it and selling to people online, just providing them a better way to get it delivered at home, essentially. My point was, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be buying locally. I want to consolidate that whole supply chain. So how that supply chain works is, you have somebody in China shipping it out to somebody in India. That person is either a distributor or warehouses all of the sensors. From that market, it goes to the wholesale market, and then people buy from wholesale and they either sell it online, or you have students buying from the wholesale market, or then wholesale market is sending to like smaller shops and it's getting spread out. And so there's profit margins kept getting added up in each of those stages. I was like, what if I combine that whole chain? What if I'm the distributor, I'm the warehouser, I am the retailer? That means the profit margin can be reduced. That means I can also bring in stuff that nobody else has. And I was able to do that. And that was like the first thing that I started. So that was the online store was the first thing. Just giving people access to that hardware was the first thing. I was just problem solving at that point of time. I didn't see it as a business. I didn't see it as it was going to be a big thing. I just wanted to solve that problem. And that problem was solved through an online store, essentially, at that point. And that led to other initiatives and other companies, six at that point. But that was the beginning.
How was it to understand, I would say, how the supply chain system works for the first time. Because if you have never thought about that, and when you first find out that, oh, everything we're using is kind of sourced from different parts of the world, it's kind of mind blowing sometimes.
Yeah,
How was it for the first time navigating and trying to understand where can I get this part from, getting in touch with this kind of people for the first time, and just your mind expands as a result. So how was that for you?
it was very I think it was very different for me. It was kind of so was very much a nerd, right? I didn't understand the business aspect of it at all, and I didn't understand supply chains at that point, and I just went for it. And so what I did was the 6 months that I did my research on, I went to every sort of wholesaler that was in the area, and I would make frequent trips there, and I would try and find the products that were common and that people were using or people were buying, the students were buying. And I was like, okay, this is the product that they're buying. But I know because I've used it in my research or I've done it through in my masters or somewhere along the line in my bunch of my internships that I did. I was like, but I know this part exists in a better quality from this other manufacturer. And what if I bought that at a very high price from that manufacturer because it went through a certain supply chain? Like, how can I reduce that price? So I got in touch directly with the manufacturers. I was like, do you have a distributor in India? They're like, we don't have a distributor. We sell sometimes to like people, usually like a retail thing, and there's a duty involved that people have to pay and students have to pay on their own. It can cost a certain amount to them. They have no idea how to deal those with those issues. You have to have certain kinds of import export certifications to import stuff, and students don't have that. So sometimes things get stuck. I was like, okay, so these are all sort of issues that exist in that supply chain. And I was like, do you want a distributor in India? And I reached out to like the CEOs and top people in these companies because I was like, how do I reach out to these people? Who do I talk to? So I reached out directly to CEOs and I tell people absolutely 100% do that because they know what's happening in their company, right? And they will be able to put you in touch with whoever is in charge of the department that you want to talk to. So they put me in touch with like the sales people of their companies and said, talk to this guy and they'll be able to guide you on how we handle distributorship agreements, how we handle like the pricing, the marking up and all that kind of stuff. We want you to have like a fixed retail price, or are you flexible on the retail? All those kinds of agreements had to be made. So it was just a journey of just figuring that out, or at the same time coding the whole e-commerce store by myself, essentially using a PHP platform as a base and then coding everything on top of it by myself. So I spent 6 months doing sort of both of those things at the same time. And I think we launched in January of 2014. And we didn't have a single order for 3 months. I was like, what happened? So clearly something I did went wrong. I think what went wrong here? So we didn't have our first order till March, I think, like end of March or early April. And I was like, okay, this is not the hit that I was expecting. I launched the online store and now it's a big thing all of a like in one day. That didn't happen. I was like, how? So that sort of iteration came into being. Okay, how can I improve this? What am I missing? Clearly, there was something missing, or people would not be. Why were people not buying the products that I brought here? So worked on that a little bit, and we started seeing sales from March, and then it never stopped. And then it just grew every year, 2x essentially, more than 2x every year sometimes. Yeah, but that logistics part of it, I got really good at it. I got really really good at figuring out supply chains, and I got really good at predicting, like myself. I didn't even need the data anymore. I got good at predicting when there would be shortages, when there would be things that might delay the shipments and things that might go wrong in just importing. So I got really good at that piece of it. And that was sort of the operational side of the business that gave me exposure to that. So yeah, so I went from being like a highly technical guy to operational and also strategy and figuring out what do the users want. So it was a very self-taught journey for me.
And I think after that, you mentioned that you started other robotics company. Could you share what was the problem, and also share like how did you figure out the problem? Because like even figuring out the problem is in itself a problem. Even that is a
Yes.
full-time job essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did the online store first, right? And then when I was launching the online store, I noticed this thing that nobody else was sharing user manuals on how to actually work with those parts. All of the other 40 something online stores, they didn't have that. They maybe had a little bit of the specs of the whatever product they were selling, but they weren't sharing things like, which I think Adafruit and SparkFun did really well, where they share how to use those products. And so nobody in India was doing it. So like I will start posting that, and I created a wiki of just working with the sensors, how to code and how to do the manual connections, electronics connections. And at a certain point, it got too big. And I was like, I need other people to do this and create the manuals for me and sort of create this wiki. And that's when I started hiring interns. And I was like, let's start building this. And when I was hiring these interns, I noticed none of them have the experience that I was looking for. Hardly anybody had used Arduino at that point of time in India, and so they had no exposure to that. So we started doing embedded C code as well as Arduino code. I taught those interns how to use the Arduino stuff, and then they would experiment with these sensors and create the codes and example codes of and libraries that could be used with these sensors. And so that's when the problem hit me, that the problem was they were not being taught that stuff in college. And so what do I do? How do I give them access to all of this hardware that I have? I have all of this. I'm setting up this online store. I have it in warehouses, one or two cheap sensors, somebody using it, and maybe making it explode is not going to affect me that much in my overall unit economics. So, how do I give people access? So, the next thing that came was the makerspace. So, this was India's first tech makerspace. I think India's second makerspace overall. And in Delhi, nobody had a makerspace at that point. And makerspace was not really a widely known concept in India at that point. So, I started that,
It's
and I
still
looked at the,
not a widely
yeah,
known concept. It's
yeah,
not as,
it's
yeah,
still
yeah,
not
yeah.
as widely known, but in the US, things were starting to change, and I was like, oh, we can have this maker culture sort of take shape here. Even if we don't get the culture, at least we have a space for people to go and build this thing, right? Build the robots, learn from me, and use these things. So that second problem got solved by me just constantly teaching people in my makerspace. And my makerspace was nothing. My makerspace was my office after hours. So my office space from 9 to 5 is my office space to use for me and my interns. And then after that, from 5 to 9 p.m., it's for everybody else to use. And on the weekends, it's for everybody else to use. So I was in the office every day, just working from like 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., right? Every day I was there. And so first part of the day, I would do whatever was necessary for my own company for the online store stuff. And second part of the day, I would just spend teaching other people, sharing, having events, organizing hackathons, doing all sorts of things that were not really common at that point of time. That sort of also took off into me going out and teaching in colleges and schools and setting up robotics laboratories in schools and teaching the teachers there. That way the teachers could teach the students all year long. I don't have to keep going back and forth. So over the period of time, so we started this online maker community also, where we had people from all over India. Yeah, I just went out to into different cities and taught people all around, and that was like the second thing. And that was, I had very selfish goals for that. Why? Because at some point I wanted to actually build robots, right? My own things. I wanted to create something that I would work on myself. I wanted to continue my R&D that I was doing. I wanted to continue the research that I had done in my masters, which was around self-driving algorithms, and I wanted to expand that and do better stuff with it, make robots that could be used in like Butler robots and things like that, which could go into people's houses essentially. So I was like, how do I create that system so that these people can go out and teach each other at a certain point, and then I don't have to teach them. They're buying products from me, right, to learn these things. They're teaching each other, and at a certain point I'll just be able to hire these people to my own team. So people who were great in the maker space, for example, went on to work for me as employees later on. And one of the first interns that I had was my first customer of the online store. So he had bought the products. His was the first order that he had done, and he was like the second intern. And when he bought the products, I asked him, what made you buy? What was it? He was like, I'm working on this project. I want this particular sensor and I can't find it in the market, and you're super close to me, and you were delivering like the next day. I was like, perfect. This is exactly what I wanted to do. I was like, what kind of projects are you working on? And he started explaining his projects. I was like, do you want to come work for me and just have access to all of my hardware and just build projects? I was like, yeah, absolutely. I want to do that. So he became like my second or third intern. So yeah, so and constantly was working at the maker space, helping other people out, and he was very good at that kind of stuff as well. And all of these sort of ecosystem started to build from there. And then the third thing was R&D that we started, like the education piece of it kind of took off. That was the third piece. And the fourth was the R&D of it. That's when we started doing R&D for other companies. We're not doing R&D for ourselves yet. We were doing R&D for other companies. We were creating prototypes for them, and because we had access to like the 3D printers of, I think my first 3D printer was like a heavy duty one that I built, and a lot of the other interns sort of helped me out with that. Some electronics interns who were better at the G code stuff and than I was, and they worked on that. And so all of us built, and our first printer was really bad actually. It did the job, but it wasn't great. But it improved over time, let's just say. And then I started getting in touch with like 3D printing people, which was also taking off at that time. So we had a startup actually use the maker space as testing ground for their 3D printer, right? And they came and did workshops for 3D printer. And Shaperjet was the name of that brand. And they sort of took off by engaging with the maker community that I had built. We sort of worked together a long time, and so those kinds of things started to happen, like this 3D printing startups coming out of that woodworks. A lot of people got into it around that time, and that's when we started doing R&D. We had access to rapid prototyping with the 3D printers already in place, electronics people already in place, coding already in place, and access to hardware that nobody else had, that we just had lying around in our warehouses, right? So so that started the R&D journey. And so that was third, that was fourth. And then the fifth one was, so I had this community of makers, right? And they had started working and building stuff, and my thing was, some of these wanted to sell stuff. They wanted to figure out what would make their product sell. They have a prototype, they have an idea, they want to figure out, is there a market for this? Are people actually going to buy this? At what price point will people buy this? And what will make them buy this? And this community of makers was not just electronics people, but artists and cosplayers and sculptors and paper mache jewelry makers, all sorts of people. And so I created what was the first sort of version of Etsy combined with eBay thing of India. So it was called Maker Mandi, and so you don't have to sell fully like end looking products. You could sell prototypes on that platform and find a market for yourself. So because at that point of time, crowdfunding had not taken off in India. This is maybe a year before crowdfunding took off. And we funded and we did a lot of events with like crowdfunding platforms as well, where, because we were making these stuff, the community was making all of this stuff, and they wanted to convert it into product and convert it into a business. My platform was like the first one. I launched it in 2015. By that time, Makers Asylum had also come to Delhi. They were originally in Mumbai. They had come to Delhi, and I had set up the electronics in Makers Asylum because I wanted other people in other parts of Delhi to have access to it. And so we did a collaboration there. And then they also had a community of architects and other sorts of people that came to their makerspace, which were not like tech nerds like us. And so that sort of like took off the platform. And then people were starting selling their products. They started selling jewelry. They started selling all kinds of things. We shut that down in 2017 though. No reason. It was doing well. It could have gone way beyond what it was. But GST laws came into place in 2017. And I was caught in this thing of, do I worry about the GST side of this? Do I And e-commerce GST had sort of changed at that point, or the taxation had changed. So I was like, will Maker Mandi be the thing that I focus on full time and require a lot more effort, or do I just shut this down? And I chose to shut it down. And instead of, but I shut it down, but all of the people who had done well on Maker Monday, who had actually converted their products into businesses, I brought them to my original online store. I was like, this thing I have total control over already. I have the supply chain already set up. And so I brought everybody who was like big sellers on those things just to my original store. And I kind of became their distributor, and we did the same thing there. So Maker Monday shut down, but not like just the website shut down, but the back end operations was still the same. And that was thing number five. And thing number six happened when I went into something totally different. So that's the robotics part.
So I would say before we go to number six, I'm just curious to know what, like, how did you get the idea that you can actually go out there and teach people? And I think you used to come to Ahmedabad as well for the Maker Fest. So how did that whole division or activity begin? Like, what was the initial thought process? How did you come up with the idea that maybe I can just go speak, and that would generate, let's say, demand? Because first would be awareness, and then people will want to engage with something like this. So what was the thought process behind that?
Robotics as a field, and I think every founder who's in this space and selling something to the public should do this by taking out whatever they have and taking it into the world and showing it off. So I would go to Maker Fest, and we had a booth at Maker Fest, and I know like the organizers of Maker Fest as well. And we had like really great placements of our booths every time because I knew the people who were setting this up. So I would showcase the actual robots that were being built. So I had like a tiny humanoid, which is like 30 centimeters tall, I think, which was the biggest one that was being sold in India at that point. Like 30 centimeters was big enough for most people, and it was being sold off as a toy, but it could do a lot of functionality and you could actually do research on it. So I actually took that to events and showed it off to people. We now 3D printers were sort of bulky at that point of time. So instead I used to take my 3D pen and have people actually work with it on the booth. Like not me doing anything, I would literally have other people work with it. And kids would come up to the place and start drawing with the 3D pen and take it home and remember the fact that they did it. And at a certain point the 3D printers were small enough that I could take it with me to events. So I had like a very small printer, 150 by 150 like cube size built volume, and I used to take that. It was very lightweight, and I used to take that to events with me. And what I would do was not have it make random stuff. I would at the event while this 3D printer was working, it was printing rings, 3D printed rings, which takes about 8 minutes to print a ring, which is super cheap, and you can print it in different sizes, which means small sizes of rings takes about like 5 to 10 minutes, let's say, right? I had all of these rings on the table. Now kids are coming up to the table and actually watching it print, and then they get to take the ring with them. That way it leaves an impact. And so while their kid is doing this, parents are standing at that booth watching their kid and watching them be fascinated and asking me questions. Where can I buy this? How do I introduce my kids to this? How do I my kids, they don't have this in the school, how can I maybe have a space where they can use this? And that's where the maker space comes into it being. Maker Fest used to happen at Sept University, which has a fab lab, and so they had a great fab lab there, so that people could go and use it. But maker spaces was also another concept that people got introduced to because of that. And so this is school level kids. Similarly with university level kids, I sponsored a bunch of events. I used to sponsor the tech fest events that happen. I used to sponsor a bunch of those. So there would be hackathons. I sponsored a bunch of research teams in Mumbai and Chennai. SRM University Chennai had a humanoids team, and I sponsored a bunch of their electronics. So university was putting in the money for these teams to build humanoids, like fully functional, big size, 5 feet, 6 feet tall humanoids, and go to international competitions for robo games and things like that. So I was like one of the initial sponsors because they needed motors for these humanoids. And who was the only supplier for these motors? Because there was nobody else in India supplying these motors at that point of time. So this whole ecosystem sort of interlinked together, right? So university students got to know me. So when they graduated, they want to work with me. So and the research kids were people who were doing research in these universities, and there was another research team in where was this? This was in Mumbai somewhere. I think Narsimunji had it. They were working on underwater robots, and they needed electronics, and they kind of reached out, and I sponsored their electronics. So all sorts of things were happening, and at like approximately the same time. So between 2015 and 2017, I was running all of these startups at the same time, right? So the online store was happening, the makerspace was running, the R&D had taken off, the education piece was also going, and Maker Mandi was in effect, sort of growing at that point of time. So I was doing 20-hour work days during those like 3 years, which is why I shut down Maker Monday. I was like, I think I can do this much better if it's under my control in like the original online store. I might be able to just not, have 20-hour work days. I may be able to do something, but that didn't work. Because as soon as Maker Monday shut down, it freed up my schedule, and I ended up doing more on the R&D side, and we ended up doing a lot more like internal projects in R&D in 2017. So as soon as that happened, I still had the 20-hour work days. It didn't change, but more time was spent, like more energy was spent on the R&D side now.
So now you are in Toronto. What made you make that decision then?
So that's where the
Like how?
transition to that
Right,
sixth
right.
thing comes in. This is 2017. Makerspace is great, and I go to the US for about a month, and as part of a program called Rajiv Circle Fellowship. And part of that fellowship is that you get to learn and connect with like the ecosystem of the Silicon Valley and sort of reuse the resources there and make connections there. And I go to the valley and I learn to do things a lot differently. And in 1 month, I learn a lot from like different founders, how they work differently, how investors work differently, how people are more open to doing crazy things a little bit, and a very supportive sort of ecosystem I saw in the valley. And I was like, oh, this is great. Maybe I could do this in India. Maybe I could be the person who builds something like this. The VC ecosystem was great, but I had limited interactions with the VC ecosystem because I used to go out and pitch to investors, but for fun, because I had bootstrapped this whole ecosystem that was funding itself. I didn't really need VC money at that point of time. And I would go out there just to see what investors were talking about and just go to pitch events and have conversations, which led to me being featured in entrepreneur magazines and all these other kinds of things in newspapers and stuff, right? So I was like just putting myself out there as a founder. Nothing, I didn't care about the investment side of it. I was running, so I came back and I thought within this maker space that I have a lot of people. What if you start an incubator for these people and actually have them go through, actually have like people dedicated to building a startup come here instead of just makers wanting to do projects. Let's have people who want to build businesses out of these projects, and sort of tied it into the Maker Mandi as well. And because I had already seen how to do that, and I had connections to crowdfunding people, so anybody who was making this and sort of wanted to convert it into a business, they could use the crowdfunding connections I have. So I was like, okay, I could probably do this. And now I had connections to investors in the US. So if they did well, I could potentially have uh, investors in the US invest in them, right? Whether I and facilitate that sort of conversation. So that was like the turning point. I was like, I want to start an incubator. And 2017 we started that incubator. I came back from the US in like end of May, June, and by I think September we had launched that initiative of the incubator. And the incubator started doing well. We had a couple of startups sort of go through that program, with me sort of keeping the oversight on that, creating the program, how things would work. How I have worked is essentially I do the thing first myself, and then when it grows to a certain point, I have other people take over and delegate at that point, because I need to know and set up the guidelines, how it's going to work. So most of my energy was focused on the incubator program, and the R&D at that point of time. So we were doing our own R&D and helping other people with their own like productization of whatever idea they had. 2019, these people were ready to sort of go out into the world and start selling and sort of start raising angel funding or investor funding, VC funding. And at that point of time, the VC industry like was like, no, if you have a hardware product, we're not going to invest in you at all. And I that took me by surprise. Like a few years ago, when I was pitching to these people, they wanted to have meetings, and I pitched to a lot of investors for fun, like totally for fun. I went to offices and pitched for like half an hour pitches to investors. I created data rooms. I didn't really need their money, but I wanted to get that experience. But 2019, suddenly nobody's offering them money. I was like, well, what happened? Turns out this whole, while I was building the incubator, 2014 to 2018, there was a hype cycle in the valley in around robotics, during which time I was in the valley and was, I thought that investors were interested in this thing. Turns out a lot of investors lost money that were in the hardware space. A lot of people lost money at that point of like 2017, end of 2017, mid of 2028 or 2018. A lot of people had lost money. And so by 2019, that trend had come to India in the VC ecosystem. And I didn't understand that there are trends in the VC ecosystem and there are hype cycles in the VC ecosystem because I was never looking at it close enough. So when that happened, these startups were too late because they had graduated the incubator. They, if they had been a year earlier, it would have been fine. They would have managed to raise funding enough to survive. So 2019 was a bad period for them. 20 end of 2018, early 2019 was a bad period for them. And I started looking at the VC ecosystem at that point. In Feb, I remember still in Feb 2019, I was like, oh, I might have to create a VC firm of my own to do this. I have no idea how to start a VC firm. I was like, and I bought like the domain name. So every initiative I've ever done is JMoon, short for Jasmeet's Moonshots. Because if it comes to me, it's my idea. I want it to be JMoon. So I bought the JMoon dot fund or something. And as I bought that in Feb 2019, I was like, I'm going to have to do this. I have no idea how, but this is needed apparently. And when I created that, I looked at the whole VC ecosystem. I was like, oh, I think I need to be in the US to do this or somewhere in North America to do this. Because clearly, if you want to start a firm that's withstanding the tide of is a long term thing, and you're creating something that will withstand all trends and that is going to create trends, it has to be somewhere in North America. So like, I think I need to be in North America to do this. And I started looking at Canada and the space, Canadian space, and I was like, oh, this is easy to get into compared to US as a citizen. So that's when I started looking at Canada, and I sort of applied for permanent residency and citizenship.
And how has it been? I mean, I think in our last conversation you shared that the startup culture here is very vibrant. There are a lot of people trying to
Hmm.
come up with ideas, pitch to investors. A lot of tech fest happening. There is one like 3 days from now, the Brampton Venture Expo. So a lot of activity happening. Could you like share? Is there like a established workflow for that activity right now? Like, do startups do make it to the next level here?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. When I got to the Canadian market, and I looked at it from like a robotics point of view early on, but since then I've sort of spread out my interests. So the first thing that Canadian ecosystem really surprised me was, and I don't see this in India, and I don't see this in US as much, where there's an incubator for everything in Canada, which is extremely surprising. You want to be in fashion, there's an incubator. You want to be in food, there's an incubator. You want to be in music, there's an incubator. You want to be in a random field, whatever it is, there's probably an incubator out there for you. And tech obviously has a bunch of incubators. And even when it comes to tech, one of the best things is incubators exist not just for tech, but for people from all different backgrounds. So if you're in tech, but you are from a certain part of the world, there might be an incubator. For example, I've heard people like wanting to start an incubator for specifically South Asian investors. Oh, so South Asian founders, sorry. There's one for essentially for LGBTQ people. There's one for women specifically, right? So it was very surprising of an ecosystem. I was like, this is great because it just promotes entrepreneurship at a whole different level. And I don't think I've seen that even in the US and India. Why? Because a lot of these incubators are actually government supported or government funded. And then you also have small business centers in pretty much every city and every major city, let's just say. The Brampton one was called the Brampton Entrepreneur Center. I think they still call that, but they might, the whole area is now called like the Brampton Venture Zone and Brampton Innovation District now, right? So Brampton Entrepreneur Center was like the first one there that I went to because I was living in Brampton at that time. So I used to either work in the library or go to the Brampton Entrepreneur Center and sort of interact with people there. And which is sort of what gave me the introduction to small business centers and business centers that were around. And Mississauga has one, Toronto has one where it's called TBDC. So these are all government supported initiatives that exist. And that is great. I've never seen that anywhere. And so founders, as long as they have an idea, they can go to these and start building their firms, essentially, right? Once they have that, most founders tend to raise funding in the US. They usually go in the US and raise funding. They also raise some funding in Canada. Canada is a little bit more risk averse when it comes to funding. The VC ecosystem is still sort of being developed at the level that is existing in the valley, I would say. So it's very different than that. But there's a lot of great angels in Canada who are trying to do some very different things, and a bunch of angel networks that exist. Some traditional ones, some people wanting to invest more in high tech stuff, some people wanting to invest in more fintech stuff. So all different kinds of angel networks exist, which is great. Brampton Angels and all of these cities also have their angel networks, right? Brampton has their own, Hamilton has their own. Across Ontario, there's a bunch of them that you can find online, and which is great. We need that angel sort of community to start off with. And so a lot of founders can raise funding from angels here, I would say, and then sort of raise a little bit more in the US at the next stage, at the seed stage, pre seed stage, and then go on to raise much bigger funding when they need to. The market in the US is obviously like 10 times bigger than Canada, right? So most of the founders that are creating something in Canada, they have this thing that they can easily go to the US, right? To expand when they're ready and when it's tested out in Canada in a smaller sort of market, and then rapidly expand in the US. Or because of the Canada UK ties, they can also expand in Europe, which is great. So they have this whole ecosystem of wherever they want to go, they can have access to both of these big markets out there. So it's a great thing. And not just robotics wise, this is like everything. And I think this applies to AI, this applies to fintech, this applies to crypto, this applies to anything that is in food, maybe whatever they want to do, right? They just have, Canada can be like their testing ground essentially. If it's not a big market in Canada, Canada has some big markets, but not for everything. So but it is a great testing ground for that kind of stuff. For medical stuff, for example, it's much easier to do things in Canada than it is in the US because of the centralized sort of healthcare, government supported healthcare system that we have. And then when you're ready to go and expand, you can just start going to the US. And I think the systems that are used are pretty much the same. Legal aspects wise, things are kind of similar. So it just becomes easier for founders here to sort of expand in other countries.
Tell me more about your VC firm. Like how are you structuring it? How are you imagining it? What is the thought process behind building a VC firm from scratch? Like how what does that look like?
So I won't go into a lot more detail, and let me preface that whatever I'm saying next is not legal advice. It's not investment advice. Please go to your, if somebody is listening to this, please go to your financial advisor for anything. My solution to start a VC firm was never to start the firm. I had the idea. I was like, I looked into the problem. I was like, how do I solve the problem? Was the thing that I wanted to do. And there were several problems that I wanted to solve. Number one problem is in the VC ecosystem, in this space that I'm in, specifically hardware and robotics and everything that I did, I noticed that there were a lot more angel investors at seed stage, right? So angel investors usually are at like angel and pre-seed stage when founders are figuring out the product. When they go from product to a business, they usually don't have angels in other sectors. Usually angels are not involved. People in hardware struggle to raise funding. Like I said, like that was the problem. I was like, oh, how do I solve this thing? They struggle to raise funding because VCs don't understand the tech side of it. A lot of VCs don't, because they're not dedicated to that. Most people are in software, most people are in fintech or other things like that. There's not a dedicated, or at least there's only a handful of dedicated VC firms that are maybe doing hardware around the world. So if you look up data on VC firms around the world, and you can probably see this on OpenVC, which has like 5,000 plus VC firms are listed on that platform. When you start to narrow it down, let's say put in the keywords of hardware stuff like robotics, IoT, maybe that number drops down to 300, like globally, 300 something. When you do it in North America, that number drops down to less than 100, right? Out of 5,000, less than 100 people who actively invest in hardware stuff. And that is itself a problem. And that includes VCs, that includes angels, that includes all sorts of people who invest. So less than 100. And which means there's just not enough opportunities for founders to go out and pitch to these people. There's just not enough funding, right? There might be some VC firm that, let's say, invests in clean tech, who might do one hardware deal, right? Because they have a robot that does some sort of a cleaning of rivers or something else. So there might be an opportunity for founders to go to clean tech investors, but not all clean tech investors are going to invest in hardware stuff. They would have to be really convinced on that and really be sold on that concept. So that was the thing. I was like, okay, why does the funding not exist? Was the first problem. The second problem was, how do I solve this? Now this can be solved by starting an angel syndicate. This could be solved by starting a dedicated angel network. This could be solved by starting a venture studio. This could be solved in hundreds of different ways. But there was one aspect of this where, and I'm going to go a little bit technical on the financial side, is, let's say you have a bunch of investors on your cap table early on in the process. Now at seed stage, you still have angels and on your cap table. Most of the founders, and there are some founders out there I know who've been raising, or who've been surviving on grants alone for like 5 7 years, right? And they haven't gotten to seed stage yet. They're still figuring it out because their grants are limiting them to what the grants are allowed to do, whatever they're allowed to do with those grants, right? They limit the funding, that you're only allowed to do it and use this money for this particular thing, and you have to show that this is the thing that you've done with the money. So it's limiting in a lot of ways. And then you have a bunch of angels continue to invest if the valuation is great, but at a certain point only super angels are able to sort of keep up at seed stage. So a lot of startups die in this sector at seed stage. After seed, they don't see series A. They die off maybe either raising seed, or after raising seed they just die down. Why? Because you have all of these investors, but not everybody is bringing value add. Not everybody is coming from an operator background. Not everybody is able to give you connections that might be helpful for your business. Not everybody, all of these angels and maybe some micro VCs or somebody is coming in, they might not have the value add that they need at that stage of converting a product into a business, which is what the founders need. Founders, and I've had this conversation with a lot of founders where I will tell them insights that I have seen that they would have eventually seen in 3 years, 5 years. It would have taken them a lot of trial and error to get to that stage. And I just tell them, oh, what you're doing is not going to work. This is not the right person to contact in this environment. Go to this person instead. Go to, if you're trying to reach out to companies or universities, go to this person in the university, not this person. So those kinds of insights they will learn eventually, but it'll take a lot of trial and error. And when you come to VC, there's usually not a lot of room for trial and error. There's some pivoting, but it needs to happen really quickly. There's not enough time to do the pivoting. You can't take 5 years to do the pivoting, right? So it's a very, they want the growth to be hyper. Essentially, they want the company to have a hockey stick curve and grow really quickly, which is how VC works. But hardware startups, if they don't get the value add, they can't see the stick curve super quickly. They'll see it eventually if they manage to scrape by and somehow work and get through certain stages. They will see that curve eventually. And I looked at that problem like, with the value add that an incubator or a venture studio brings, where it's all about the mentorship. Essentially, the founder is doing the main thing. So if you are able to give the mentorship and the guidance and the strategic operator level sort of insights, you could potentially accelerate this process. And I tested this out with a few of the companies that I invested in, and I was like, oh, this actually does work, right? uh, they are now not wasting 3 years in figuring out the user insights. Now they have them, and they can just start accelerating their marketing on that and focusing their sales team on those kinds of things. So that was another issue. There was a, and then obviously at the end of that is this the perception problem of the VC ecosystem. Like, hardware is hard, and hardware is tougher to get into, or hardware doesn't have the returns, when all of the data points to absolutely something different. So in between this transition of when I was going from incubator to moving to Canada, I had a conversation with a founder and a founder friend of mine, and they were like, you know what? I look at Crunchbase and I use Crunchbase for accessing people whom might want to work with, because they were working as like a fractional CEO. And I see a company and I use this Crunchbase funding and I go in and offer my services. Like, that's a great idea. And then I started looking at it and I was like, what can I do with the Crunchbase data? Crunchbase has all of this data. What can I do with it? What can I do with crowdfunding data? I've invested in so much. I have all of my data as well of things I've invested in. But what can I do with this? So I created an AI that sort of helps me with the decision making process of the investments, of analyzing markets and doing things that I would not be able to do on my own. And so when I created that AI, I was like, oh, this is great. I could probably potentially convert this into a startup. I thought about it, but then I ended up keeping it as an internal tool for me to analyze markets. But it accesses like 6 million data points from Crunchbase and scraping the internet, a bunch of websites, and I have access to that and I use that internally. So I was like, okay, this is another problem. The data tells me that the returns are not an issue at all. The hardware industry gives you great returns. If you stick with it, it gives you great returns. On in a software company, in a VC environment, you have funding happening at seed, series A, series B, series C, D, E. And if you combine the funding that goes into software and you consolidate that towards the beginning stages of hardware, so you invest a lot in the early stages on hardware, the returns at the end of that are great. And that's not me, that's just the data. And that's from all sorts of companies from around the world, right? So the returns are great, but people are scared of the intense capital investment required in the early days. People don't want to do that. The great part about that is it doesn't require that anymore. Because if you have rapid prototyping, if you have manufacturing that is scalable, you can go from, so, and there are manufacturers out there who can now do anything from 10 pieces to 10,000 pieces of an electronics board, right? So they can scale with you. So it doesn't have to be as capital intensive if you understand the user insights. If you're not overspending, if you're not saying, oh, this will be a big thing, but then it turns out to not be a big thing. So you need somebody to keep that sort of psychology in check of what the founder is spending on. And telling the founder, like, hey, hold off on this. It might not be in as much demand as you think it is, right? So those kinds of things, like again, there's an interplay of understanding the tech side, understanding the business side, understanding the venture side on this thing. And for me, that was, and I spent 5 years, like I moved here in 2019, and so I spent 5 years, a little bit of that time just working on the AI, little bit of time working on my strategy on how I look at investments, going back and looking at all of my investments I've done since 2013 and saying, this is the framework that exists. Most investors don't even have a framework to within this industry, which is a problem. And so most investors back out because they don't understand if it is a good or a bad investment. So for example, if you want to look up SaaS metrics, you say what makes a good SaaS startup at seed stage, and you can Google that and find uh, results of the metrics that a SaaS company needs to hit to be able to consider a good deal, or what most VCs consider a good deal. And that's because so many people have invested in it. There's actually data on figuring out those metrics that doesn't exist in hardware, because not a lot of, like I said, a lot of people have not invested in hardware. They don't understand it. For whatever reason, they haven't gotten into it, which makes that data pool quite small. And it's not generalized. It's not one business model. SaaS is one business model that you can just invest in. Hardware has all sorts of different business models, which are very tough to sort of figure out, and all sorts of different industries that they're impacting. So there's hardware in IoT, could be impacting houses, and you could have personal IoT B2C, where people have IoT devices in their houses. But you could also have IoT in construction, which is a B2B environment. You could also have IoT being used in oil and gas, which is again a very different environment. So all of these industries are very different. So it's very hard for one person to, if they've not done investments in everything, and most of my portfolio is hardware, which made me see through the fog essentially and figure out, oh, this is the going to be the framework of my investing in whatever phase I do it. Going forward, just learning from that whole experience and putting all of the 10 years of experience of investing in various things and losing money and making money and all those kinds of things, and creating and putting it into a form that was, oh, this is just data at this point. This is how this frameworks exist. If you are at seed stage, this is what you need to have to be existing at seed stage. If you're if you're not at this, if you've not done these things, you're not at seed stage. No matter what you're doing, no matter what you're saying, you are not at that seed stage if you have not hit those targets. And if you're not at that seed stage, so either you're overvalued, or you're saying that you're at seed stage, or so you're either overvalued, the deal is wrong, something is wrong. You could be close to reaching the seed stage, but you are not there yet. So then it's a call on how close are they able to get to the seed stage and beyond or not. So just having, using my experience, combining it with like overall market data, and then coming up with a framework that was specific to this industry was a challenge that I spent over, like, I think 2 years just working on that and creating that framework, which was so that took a while just to get to that stage. And so that's sort of the journey of how to even start a VC firm. Like, you can't just go into it thinking I'm going to start a VC firm, because when you start a VC firm, and this is true for all GPs, anybody who wants to start a firm, it's, A, do you want to do this? So I had that conversation with myself last year. Like, do I actually want to do this? Because now, if I go into this, I will, or any GP who goes into this needs to go into this with a mindset of, I will probably be doing this for the next 15, 20 years, right? For me personally, I'm 35 right now, which means I'll be around 50, 55, almost close to retirement at that point of time. If I ever actually go for retirement, I probably won't retire ever. But I'm close to that age. And so, will I be able, do I want to continue doing this for 15, 20 years? Do I want to give up the building of robots that I love to do and just go and do this and help other people build their robots? My mission of in my life has been to build robots and help other people build theirs. And now do I want to go from just working on helping other people build theirs instead of not building as much myself? So I had that conversation with myself, and I mentored with 15 incubators last year, and I did nothing else. And I just mentored with incubators, all sorts of incubators, not just hardware ones, just to see if I enjoy that process of engaging with founders. So that was sort of the leaping point of like, okay, I think I want to do this. I think this is, I'm ready for doing this. I've spent the last 5 years doing everything to get to this stage. I went through an MBA. I actually finally got my executive MBA during that 5 years. Like, I went through this whole thing just to be able to start the VC firm because I know that it needs to exist. So that's the sort of the journey into that.
And you mentioned when you look at the data, it tells you a different story. And you also shared this keyword data room. Could you share what is a data room?
So data room is when a startup is raising funding from investors. And I'll tell you my first exposure to that as well. But data room is essentially your pitch deck, your financials, your potential LOIs that you might have from customers, any details that will help make the investors decision on why they should invest in you, and that you're not a stagnant company, that you're actually a growing company. And so at certain point you're going to get to $1 billion valuation, or you're going to get a 10 billion valuation, whatever, what the market size is. So a lot of investors also do their own due diligence on actually making sure that what you're saying is true. Like, you are claiming that the market size is like $10 billion. Is it actually 10 billion, or is it 100 billion, or maybe only 1 billion? So that's the due diligence part of it. But they want to make sure that their due diligence and the data that you are projecting match, right? So if you're saying you're going to be $1 billion company, is there actually potential for you to be $1 billion company? Do you have the right team? So it may also include executive summaries on your team and what they've done in the past. Financial data early on in the startups at like the angel stage, there's not a lot of financial data available. So it's just what the idea is, what the background is, what makes the founder the right founder to do pursue this idea, kind of thing. And then as they progress, financial data sort of needs to be included in it. At a certain point, in the early stages, you can maybe probably get away with just having a business model canvas, but in the later stages you might need a business plan of what 6 months, what 10, a year down the line, what that looks like for you. How are you going to raise further funding? What are the milestones you're going to hit from when you're raising this funding? How are you going to be deploying this funding, whatever you're raising right now? So all of that combined is sort of in the data. So and my exposure to that was when I went to investors for the first time, for VC investors. I had no idea. I just had a pitch deck, and I would go to networking events, and I would meet associates, and I would pitch to them. And I had a thriving business at this point. Like, my businesses were running quite smoothly at this point. And I think Makerspace was already done. R&D was also there, so that whole ecosystem was already built. And when I went to that conversations with the associates, and then the associate said, you know what, I'll put you in touch with my GP, which I had never had before at that point. So I had my first conversation with the GP, and the GP said, I like this, send me the financials in like 48 hours. And I did not have the financials ready because I was not ready for that conversation to go that well. So at that point, I was like, I might take a little bit longer for the financials. Give me a little bit more time. And he was like, also send me the business plan. Don't forget the business plan, which can sometimes be like 20 pages to 40, 50 pages. And I didn't have that prepared at all because I usually work off of the business model canvas. I didn't really need to have the thing outlined. So yeah, that was my first exposure to that. Did not go well, but I learned a lot on how to create data rooms and be well prepared with the data room before you actually start talking to investors, instead of preparing when the investor wants it to be done. Because in 48 hours, you won't have time to prepare it. So it was very exciting conversation for me. And I worked around the clock just to actually, I think I got it done in like 52 hours or something, a little bit above the 48-hour limit that I was given. But yeah, definitely have that prepared sort of early on.
So, what kind of a timeline do you have in mind to, let's say, start the VC firm or something like that?
Starting a VC firm is very much like being a founder. I didn't expect it to be, but it's very much like being a founder in the fact that you're pitching to people, and you're reaching out to your LPs and saying, hey, invest in this idea I have. We don't have any revenue yet, so this is a pre-seed idea stage company that you're essentially asking people to sort of invest in. This is the thing I'm planning on starting. This is my reputation, and this is why I want you to be an investor and sort of get to that stage. And I want to do this and invest in other companies. So what that is, like an idea stage company, as all idea stage companies, it it's very hard for first time founders to do it. Only if you have traction, if you've actually had experience in creating a company before, do you find VCs who back you and on your idea alone. It's very hard for other people. If you've never built a company before, people will usually not invest in just the idea. They want to see something before you get to that stage. So luckily I have the experience of investing overall in my own portfolio. Sort of like I said, my whole portfolio is hardware, majority of it. And so I'm having conversations with people, and uh, we'll see how that goes, and on how to launch and when to launch, and kind of have. I'm happy to go in detail on how it's usually done. I can't really share how I'm going to do it.
So we can, like, have another conversation few months down the line when you feel, like there is more clarity and progress, which you
Hmm.
can also share.
Yeah, absolutely. So I went through this. For me personally, the clarity is there. Like I said, I've been preparing for this for 5 years, right? So the clarity came in stages, sort of, but it's already there now. Now I have a whole vision of what it's going to look like, what it's going to be, what we are going to do, how we are going to do it, all that kind of stuff. But for a lot of VCs, that clarity is not always there. So I tell a lot of people who are wanting to start a VC firm, make sure you do your homework. If you've never been in that industry, it can still be a very daunting industry to go into. But if you do your homework right, if you prepare yourself properly, if you have a strategy, if you have something that is different about you that nobody else has, you will get in, and you will be able to start this, and you will be able to. One of the things I went through is last year, I went through a bunch of programs while I was doing the incubator mentorship. I also made sure that I was working on things that would make me better in whatever I was doing, with the goal of starting the VC firm, right? So yeah, over the last 5 years, I've sort of mentally prepared myself. I've actually skilled wise upskilled myself to a point where I was confident enough in my abilities. I created the frameworks, the operating procedures, everything, that how things would function in a VC firm. And I learned that from other people. I learned that from GPs in my network who I connected with over the years, and uh, asked them to mentor me over, on how to build this thing, or how people actually do this. So yeah, so I've had those conversations with a lot of people, and I'm happy to have those conversations on in a few months down the line of how to do this. If you are starting a VC firm, if you're planning on starting a VC firm, how to actually go about doing it. What are the things that are required to actually start a firm like that?
Well, this was, yeah, I would say, those are all the questions I had in mind so far.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we can definitely do another one few months down the line, and I can tell you about all the investment side of things if you have any doubts there, and how investments work, and how angels work, and how micro VCs work versus PE, and all those kinds of things. I'm happy to have those conversations as well.
So, would you be talking about how you plan to do it? or like how the industry kind of function, the two aspects to it?
I think talking about how the industry does it makes more sense to people, you know, because then anybody can who is planning on doing it can do it, instead of not just people who are planning on going into hardware. For example, if anybody wants to start a VC firm in any sector, whether it's crypto or whether it's something else that's coming up in AI, or what else is coming up these days, XR or something specific, and they could be anywhere in the world. So knowing how to start a VC firm in general, I think is a good thing that anybody should know.
And there is a trend where every VC firm, not every VC firm, but a lot of VC firms that I am coming across, they are becoming really specific into the sector they want to go for. Is that because the LPs are kind of becoming more specialized?
Yeah, that's also a part of it. I would say more than that, it's so what happens in VCs is you can diversify your portfolio, and founders should understand how this works, because if they don't understand VC industry, it's not going to go well for them when they do fundraising. So they need to understand how VCs think also. So in the VC industry, you can be very thematic, which is going into a particular sector and just focusing on that sector alone. Or you could have, there's only three things that you can essentially be. It's either the sector, it's either like the geographic location that you might be in, like, oh, I will only invest in Canada, it doesn't matter where, what industry. And then you're sector agnostic and stage agnostic. And the third thing is the stage. So let's say you come up with an idea that says, I will only invest in B2B SaaS at all stages across anywhere in the world. And that's very wide, but then you just focus on the B2B SaaS of it. And then you can go narrow that down and say, oh, I want to be in this particular geography, I only want to be in the US, and I only want to invest in pre-seed and seed, or I only want to invest in at series A. So these are the only three sort of criteria that you can have when you're deciding on what to invest in. VC firms that are very thematic, that are very focused on one particular theme, and this is data probably saying this, and I've looked at it from a lot of for a lot of industries, they see better returns. Why? Because and most of these thematic VC firms are coming from people who've been founders in those industries. So they understand those industries deeply, and they can discern the right startup in those firms in a way that other VCs can't, right? So if somebody, for example, asked me how a B2B SaaS company works, I would not be able to tell them anything. I might be able to help them out operationally. I don't really keep track of their business model. I don't keep track of that industry, specifically if they are in a particular industry that I don't usually keep track of. I keep my I have a portfolio of companies across like different sectors and markets that I like, but it might not be in the market that they are in. Having somebody with a technical sort of background go into VC is great, because they can create similar things that I have done. So I created the framework, they might have a very different framework based on their experience, right? So they are better equipped to get much better returns from those startups, because they can also give value add, they can also make connections to people, they can also help accelerate those startups in a very different way than most other VCs might be able to. So the broader you are, usually the later stage you are. So it's very in the early stages, because founders want the value add. Most VCs are very focused on particular geography, particular sector, particular stage of investing. So that's why it's probably you're seeing that trend happen sort of a lot more these days, I would say.
Yeah, even like you were mentioning clean tech, green tech, environmental tech. There are just VC firms who are just trying to find. So I would say few years ago, I would get very fascinated that like I didn't know, right? Like how big all these sectors were. So my idea was okay, they have X million dollars ready to invest in just clean tech in a very specific geographical location. And I had no idea how vibrant all these sectors were at the time. I still don't, I would say. Most of the sectors, like I was reading about this company who make autonomous robots that go underwater to do surveillance.
Hmm.
And so all these big companies who are laying down pipes to provide the internet across the ocean. So this robotics company, they just make autonomous robots. They go underwater and
Right.
make sure everything is all right. And if it's not all right, they also have tools to fix it.
That's awesome.
Right. Yeah, amphibious robots.
Yeah,
Right.
that's a really great idea. Put me in touch with that startup. I'd love to. I'd love to talk to them.
I think it's a Canadian company, probably.
Oh, yeah, that's perfect. I'd love to talk to them. I haven't come across them yet, but I'd love to talk to them. Yeah, so there's opportunities in all different sectors. If somebody is getting into clean tech and they're starting a firm that's focused on investing in clean tech, I think we definitely need that. We, the world, we're seeing the effects of global warming all across the world right now, and I definitely think we need to add more companies in that sector where clean tech and environment is super important. And if the governments are not going to step up or at least take like massive initiatives, then companies have to at certain point, right? And bigger companies may not have the incentives to do it, where smaller companies might be able to do much better in that sector. I think that's great. That's a great sector to be in. How you approach to solving that problem is very different. So not all problems need robots. Like even though I love robots, even though I famously say that every single science field ever in existence leads into robotics, and you can find use cases for everything. But not all problems need a robotic solution. Sometimes it can be done without the use of robots. Sometimes it can be done different ways. But we definitely need to do more. And not just in that. There are certain sectors that I didn't even know about when I moved to Canada. Like so there's markets in Canada, like I said, there's few big markets in Canada that I didn't even know about before moving and sort of looking at the ecosystem. For example, medical is a big one. um, Elder care is another big sector.
Assisted living.
Assisted living is a big thing in Canada specifically, because Canada has this aging population issue, right? US is also sort of going through that. Japan already went through it. China is also sort of going through it right now. So China, what they did was, because they now see a problem, they already had the manufacturing set up. They're relying heavily on the automation piece of it to sort of solve that problem. Canada is not yet doing that. So it's a great potential for markets to be in Canada if they want to get into elder care, or take over tasks from within that industry. So let's say you are in an environment where a nurse is, or somebody is taking care of elderly people, right? But you don't create a robot to help those elderly people out. You create a robot that may solve the problem for people who are taking care of those elderly, right? So you reduce that other person's task, who is now more social with the people who are in the assisted living. They're now interacting with the people more, and they're not spending like 10 seconds figuring out their medical stuff. And because man is a social animal, so we want interaction even in our old age. Specifically in old age, people only have human interaction left to do. Like they can't do running, they can't do they might be not physically able to do a lot of the activities that they were probably doing at a younger age. So now all that is left to them is people coming to see them, right? So if you don't have people coming to see them, if they don't have social interaction with people who are in their either vicinity or coming to see them, it leads to isolation, which is also not great. So elderly, if you can have people whose job sort of now currently involves interacting with the elderly, but also doing a lot of documentation and doing a lot of back end operational stuff that takes away a lot of their time, why not have those people be a lot more social and take away the operational side of it, automate the operational piece of this, right? So that is one big market. Another big market is agriculture, specifically in Canada, because we have a growing population, whether it's coming from uh, a lot of immigrants are coming in and a lot of other things are happening, but not a lot of people are going into agriculture. Even immigrants are not going into agriculture. So that needs to be automated to a certain point. People, uh, Canada has a thriving sort of immigration policy, and we have a lot of professionals coming in. But most of those professionals are in different fields. They're not really agriculture people. So that's one big market. Another one is retail. Um, Canada has now shifted its policy on uh, immigration, where they are saying less students and more professionals coming in, right? But most of the retail is built on students working part time. Most of the retail industry of Canada is built on that. Students working minimum wage jobs and sort of working part time. So if less students are going to come in over the next few years, that means it's going to leave jobs for gaps, and professionals are not going to want to go into that industry. If somebody's in IT, they want to go into IT, they don't want to get a retail job, right? So that is going to be an impacted fairly. That industry is going to be massive, where automation can sort of help, robots can sort of help. So those are like two three industries where in Canada alone are going to have massive sort of impact. Similar thing can also happen in the US, but I would say Canada specifically will see a lot more impact in those things. So there's a lot of industries, yeah, and specifically in automation, that are going to be impacted for sure.
Well, Jasmeet, I would say this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I want to do it again. That'll be great.
How was your experience retrospecting and thinking through all these different experiences that you have had over the years?
I was thinking through all of this. Oh my god, that was great. That was, yeah. I don't often think about the past. I think about what I'm going to be doing next. Usually, I think about where I'm going and what the next 5, 10, 15 years looks like, and I've always had that sort of thing. I don't usually get to go nostalgic on a lot of things. But this was fun getting to sort of sharing my journey, and I hope some people learn from that. And anybody who wants to talk about hardware, whether it's founders, whether it's investors who want to get into it, or whatever, angels or VCs, or I'm happy to talk to them at any point of time. But this was interesting.
Thank you
I
so much
really
for this.
like this conversation. Yeah,
Yeah.
this was really good.